Beyond the Fairy Tale, Critiques and Expansions of Propp's Narrative Theory. Welcome to this lecture on narrative theory. In our previous session, we meticulously examined Vladimir Propp's Morphology of the Folktale, a foundational text that introduced a structural framework for analyzing Russian fairy tales through its identification of 31 distinct functions. Propp's work, published in 1928, was revolutionary, offering a systematic and almost algorithmic approach to dissecting narrative form, reducing complex tales to their irreducible sequential units of action. However, like all seminal theories, Propp's model, while immensely influential, possesses inherent limitations that became apparent as scholars sought to apply its rigorous framework more broadly. Today, we'll embark on a critical examination of these limitations, explore the pivotal academic responses and adaptations his work inspired, and ultimately, trace the trajectory toward more flexible and comprehensive narrative frameworks. These expanded frameworks are crucial for accommodating the vast and intricate range of global storytelling traditions that extend far beyond the specific corpus Propp investigated. Limitations of Propp's model. To begin, we must candidly address the inherent limitations of Propp's highly influential model, understanding that these are not necessarily flaws in his analysis of Russian fairy tales, but rather boundaries to its universal applicability. Cultural and historical specificity. The first, and perhaps most significant critique of Propp's 31-function structure is its cultural and historical specificity. Propp meticulously derived his entire model exclusively from a finite corpus of Russian fairy tales, specifically those categorized under Arne Thompson types 300 to 749. While this focused approach undeniably allowed for remarkable depth and precision within that particular genre, it inherently restricts its universal applicability to all forms of narrative. When structuralists and folklorists inspired by Propp's methodological rigor attempted to apply his framework to narratives outside of its original cultural and historical context, its limitations quickly became apparent. Many narratives from diverse storytelling traditions, operating under different aesthetic and cultural principles, simply feature structures and motifs that do not align seamlessly with Propp's predetermined functions. The very definition and sequence of functions often prove inadequate for tales from non-European contexts. For instance, consider the rich oral traditions of sub-Saharan Africa, where narratives frequently embody different organizational principles. Scholars studying these traditions have consistently noted that they often feature elements such as communal actions or spiritual dimensions that are either absent from or not explicitly captured by Propp's framework. Propp's model, rooted in the secularized heroic quests of European fairy tales, emphasizes individual actions driving a plot toward a particular resolution. In contrast, many African narratives might prioritize collective experience, the maintenance of social harmony, or the unfolding of cosmological patterns, rather than the isolated exploits of a single protagonist. The notion of a villain or donor, as defined by Propp, might not accurately reflect the complex interpersonal or spiritual forces at play in such tales. Similarly, an examination of indigenous narratives from the Americas or Oceania reveals further divergences. These stories often emphasize reciprocal relationships between humans and the natural world, ancestral guidance, or the transmission of cultural knowledge through nonlinear recursive forms. Propp's linear sequence of functions, designed for narratives that move from a lack to its liquidation, struggles to account for stories that are fundamentally about maintaining balance, re-establishing a relationship, or illustrating a cyclical worldview where events do not necessarily proceed along a simple cause and effect chain towards a single definitive conclusion. This observation does not diminish Propp's incisive analysis of his chosen data, but it highlights a crucial constraint on its broader extrapolation as a universal narrative grammar. His model is an excellent tool for its intended purpose, but it proves less effective when applied outside the specific cultural and historical boundaries from which it was derived. Rigid structural sequencing. Another significant point of contention lies in Propp's insistence on a rigid structural sequencing. His 31 functions, as you recall, follow a strict, predetermined linear order. Function 1 must precede function 2, and so on, culminating in function 31. This strict sequentiality, while undeniably systematic for the fairy tales he studied, and a strength for establishing a predictable pattern, severely restricts its applicability to narratives employing more complex or varied structural arrangements. Consider the prevalence of nonlinear storytelling techniques in modern, and even some traditional narratives. How does Propp's model accommodate flashbacks, where past events are inserted into a present narrative flow? What about flash forwards, which reveal future outcomes before the intervening actions occur? Or parallel plots, where multiple storylines unfold concurrently, sometimes intersecting, sometimes remaining distinct? Propp's strictly sequential model offers little mechanism to account for these deviations from strict chronological progression. The very concept of mapping a story onto a rigid progression of functions becomes strained when events are deliberately presented out of chronological order or occur simultaneously across different narrative strands. For example, consider the film Christopher Nolan's Memento, 2000, which famously unfolds in reverse chronological order. Each scene is presented backward, mirroring the protagonist's amnesia. Attempting to apply Propp's 31 functions to such a structure would be futile, as the very premise of the film relies on the deconstruction and reordering of a linear chain of events. The audience's understanding is built through assembling fragments, not by following a predictable sequence of functions. Similarly, consider the episodic storytelling prevalent in contemporary television series like Vince Gilligan's Breaking Bad, 2008-2013. While a macro arc exists, individual episodes often feature independent mini-narratives, non-linear sequences within episodes, or character-driven developments that do not neatly fit a predefined functional progression. The overall narrative progression is often driven by the unfolding of consequences and the gradual transformation of characters across extended periods, rather than a single, predefined linear quest. The strict requirement of Propp's model, that each function occurs only once and in a fixed order, renders it ill-suited for analyzing such flexible and sprawling narrative forms. The very notion of omitting a function or reordering them within Propp's original framework is problematic, as it undermines the core premise of his morphological analysis. Simplification of narrative roles. Finally, Propp's identification of 7 spheres of action or roles, such as the hero, the villain, the donor, the helper, and the sought-for person, represents a significant simplification. These roles classify characters by their participation in specific functions within the plot, rather than examining their internal properties, motivations, or personal development. For Propp, the function was the elementary unit of narrative, with the roles merely serving as the initiators or recipients of these functions. His focus was on the what happened, not the who from a psychological standpoint. While these functional roles provide a useful shorthand for analyzing his specific set of tales, they often oversimplify the arrangement and interaction of agents in a vast array of other stories. In many storytelling traditions, a single character may fulfill multiple roles throughout a narrative, or a particular role may be distributed among several characters. For instance, an antagonist might at one point inadvertently act as a donor by providing an object the protagonist needs, or a helper might later become an opponent through a change in circumstances or allegiance. Furthermore, the initiation of functions by characters can shift, evolve, or be ambiguous, presenting a dynamic complexity that Propp's static roles may not fully capture. His model does not provide a robust framework for analyzing characters whose identities are fluid, whose motivations are complex, or whose relationships are multifaceted. Propp's analysis is a study of plot mechanics and the formal distribution of actions, not a theory of character in terms of internal representation or interaction beyond the functional level. It's crucial to understand that for Propp, these roles were simply convenient labels for the agents that perform the functions, without delving into their complex representations as people or into a theory of character development beyond this operational definition. Terse early responses and adaptations. The intellectual curiosity sparked by Propp's work, far from being stifled by its limitations, led to profound engagements that, while acknowledging his contribution, highlighted his model's shortcomings and simultaneously propelled narrative theory in new and intellectually stimulating directions. Structuralist approaches. One of the most prominent early responses came from Claude Lévi-Strauss, the renowned French structuralist anthropologist. Lévi-Strauss, while recognizing Propp's groundbreaking contribution to identifying plot mechanics, offered a fundamental critique that shifted the focus of structural analysis. He argued that Propp was overly fixated on the syntagmatic axis of narrative, that is, the linear chain of events and their sequential arrangement. Lévi-Strauss contended that a more profound understanding of narrative required attention to the paradigmatic axis, which concerns the underlying structural relations, semantic fields, and fundamental binary oppositions that organize a narrative's meaning. Lévi-Strauss proposed that narratives, particularly myths, function to mediate or resolve fundamental binary oppositions inherent in human thought and culture. He saw myths as a way for societies to logically resolve fundamental contradictions that could not be reconciled in empirical reality. Consider opposing concepts such as nature versus culture, life versus death, raw versus cooked, or chaos versus order. For Lévi-Strauss, storytelling transcended mere plot progression. It functioned as a form of cultural logic, allowing societies to grapple with and symbolically resolve deep-seated contradictions within their worldview. Thus, while Propp investigated the how of the plot, the sequence of actions and their formal relations, Lévi-Strauss was more concerned with the underlying structural relations and their cognitive implications. The why certain story elements are chosen and how they reflect deeper cultural and intellectual structures. He viewed the elements of a story as a system of signs that, when analyzed paradigmatically, like a vertical axis of options in language, reveal the underlying conceptual structures of a culture. This was a crucial methodological divergence, moving analysis from the surface arrangement of events to the deeper, often unconscious organization of meaning. Cross-cultural applications. Beyond theoretical critiques, practical attempts to apply Propp's model to various storytelling traditions outside of its original Russian fairy tale context served as powerful empirical demonstrations of its limitations. These real-world tests of Propp's purported universality solidified the need for alternative and more flexible approaches. For instance, in some West African storytelling traditions, such as those of the Yoruba people, the narrative emphasis often lies on communal agents and collective actions, rather than the individualistic dynamics central to Propp's framework. A Yoruba folktale might center on a communal struggle, a collective decision-making process, or a moral dilemma affecting an entire group, where the actions and transformations of individual agents are assessed by societal norms, and their participation is intrinsically tied to group consensus. Propp's predefined roles and functions, designed for the individual heroic quest, often prove inadequate for representing narratives where the collective is the primary driving force or locus of meaning. The lack and its liquidation might apply to a community's well-being rather than an individual's desire. Similarly, detailed studies of Japanese folktales have consistently highlighted the importance of cyclical structures, often reflecting natural patterns like the seasons, the cycles of life and transformation, or the continuous interaction between the human and spiritual realms. These narratives don't always drive towards a singular climax and definitive resolution, as Propp's linear model suggests. Instead, they might loop back, revisit themes, or illustrate ongoing balances and transformations. For example, stories involving kami, spirits, or interactions with the natural world often emphasize harmony or disequilibrium and its restoration rather than a fixed series of antagonistic functions. This stands in direct contrast to a linear progression where each function propels the plot inexorably forward. These stories often primarily reinforce worldviews and structural principles related to interconnectedness and balance, rather than achieving a final individual-centric outcome. These cross-cultural applications were pivotal. They demonstrated a clear need. While Propp provided essential insights into the mechanics of certain narrative forms, a more expansive and adaptive framework was urgently required. Such a framework would need to account for the immense variety of storytelling forms and purposes, while still retaining some of Propp's fundamental insights into the systematic analysis of narrative structure. It was about refining the analytical toolkit, not discarding the valuable instruments it contained. Third, moving beyond rigid function sequences. The recognition of Propp's specificities catalyzed a profound shift in narrative theory, leading to a more adaptive understanding of narrative. The challenge became how to retain the analytical power of structuralism without imposing a rigid, uniform framework on the vast world of stories. This led to the development of models that prioritized flexibility and broader applicability. Flexible narrative models. As scholars grappled with the limitations of rigid sequencing, a new generation of narrative theorists sought to develop more flexible and broadly applicable frameworks. This movement marked a crucial evolution in the field, moving beyond prescriptive sequences to more descriptive patterns. One of the most influential of these was Todorov. Instead of fixed plot functions, Todorov proposed a more general 5-stage narrative structure centered on a cyclical pattern of equilibrium, disruption, recognition, resolution, and new equilibrium. This model posits that most narratives begin in a state of relative stability, which is then disturbed by an event or force. This disruption leads to a recognition of the imbalance, prompting efforts towards a resolution. The story concludes with a new state of equilibrium, which may or may not be identical to the initial one. This approach prioritizes thematic cohesion and the transformation depicted in the narrative over a strict adherence to a specific sequence of events. The specifics of actions taken within each stage and the agents involved can differ widely, allowing for much greater variability in plot progression. A disruption, for instance, could be an external force, an internal conflict, or a sudden discovery. This flexibility makes Todorov's model applicable to a far wider range of genres and cultural narratives than Propp's. Another significant contribution came from Ronald Tobias, who, in his study of plot patterns, identified recurring forms across different genres and narrative traditions. Instead of discrete functions, Tobias focused on broader thematic categories or plots, such as the quest, revenge, riddle, rivalry, sacrifice, or maturation. These forms provide a loose structural guide, allowing for immense variability in execution. For example, a quest plot can manifest as a hero seeking a tangible magical object, a scientist pursuing a fundamental discovery, or a character embarking on a journey of self-discovery. The underlying structural pattern of seeking and overcoming obstacles remains, but the specific events and agents are highly adaptable. These models emphasize adaptability and thematic depth over a purely mechanical sequential structure. They shift the focus from a prescriptive checklist of actions to a more descriptive understanding of narrative movements and underlying patterns, providing more expansive tools for analyzing diverse storytelling forms. Case study, non-European narratives revisited. To further illustrate the necessity of these flexible models, it is instructive to return to the examination of certain non-European narratives. These traditions fundamentally contrast with Propp's linear, agent-focused framework and powerfully demonstrate how storytelling can reflect complex cultural structures rather than conforming to universal structural rules. In many Yoruba folktales, for example, such as the myth of Abara Meji, agents often evolve not through a series of fixed plot points driven by singular action, but dynamically through communal assessment and collective participation. The narrative's focus shifts from the lone protagonist's journey to the ethical and social dimensions that organize a community, with structural lessons often emerging from shared experience. The resolution in a Todorovian sense might be a return to communal harmony, or a new understanding of shared responsibility, rather than the individual hero's triumph. Similarly, many Native American myths frequently feature cyclical storytelling that reflects natural rhythms, such as the cycle of seasons or the continuous interplay of forces in the natural world. These narratives don't always drive towards a single climax and definitive resolution, as Propp's linear model presumes. Instead, they often loop back, revisit themes, or illustrate ongoing balances and transformations. For instance, creation myths or stories about the trickster figure might emphasize a continuous process of becoming, or a recurring pattern of disruption and re-establishment of order, rather than a linear progression where each function propels the plot inexorably toward a fixed outcome. These stories primarily reinforce worldviews and structural principles related to interconnectedness and balance, rather than achieving a final, definitive, individual-centric outcome. These compelling examples underscore that storytelling is not merely a sequence of events. It is a powerful cultural practice, deeply embedded in the organizing principles and worldviews of its originators. Broader frameworks, like those proposed by Todorov or Tobias, are therefore more capacious, allowing scholars to analyze these narratives by identifying their inherent patterns without forcing them into a rigid external mold. Modern media and nonlinear storytelling. The advent and rapid evolution of modern media have significantly expanded the landscape of narrative, presenting new challenges and opportunities for storytelling. Propp's model, designed for the linear, often single-protagonist Russian fairy tale, struggles significantly to account for these complexities, highlighting the need for more adaptable analytical tools. In the realm of film, movies like Christopher Nolan's Inception, 2010, exemplify narratives that profoundly challenge traditional notions of linear progression. With its fragmented timelines, dreams nested within dreams, and layered realities, the very concept of a simple chronological plot is deconstructed. Mapping Propp's 31 functions onto such a recursive and non-sequential structure becomes fundamentally inadequate. The audience is invited to piece together meaning from discontinuous narrative fragments, where causality can be ambiguous and temporal order is deliberately subverted. This cinematic approach emphasizes the cognitive engagement of the viewer in constructing the narrative experience, rather than passively receiving a linear sequence of events. Perhaps nowhere is the shift from rigid sequencing and predetermined roles more apparent than in video games. A title like Nintendo's The Legend of Zelda: Breath of the Wild, 2017, represents a radical departure from conventional authored narratives. Players are granted an unprecedented degree of agency, shaping their own narrative paths through exploration, choice, and emergent gameplay within a vast open world. While an overarching objective, e.g., defeating a main antagonist, may exist, the means of achieving it, the order in which story elements are discovered, and the specific sub-narratives engaged are largely determined by the player's interaction. This dynamic, interactive storytelling fundamentally emphasizes the participant's experience and choices over a fixed, authored narrative. Propp's model, with its fixed functions and roles for a passive recipient, simply cannot account for a narrative that is, in essence, co-created by the consumer through their actions and decisions within the game world. The concept of a singular donor, or villain, becomes fluid when a player can choose to engage or bypass specific challenges and characters, or when narrative events are triggered by exploration rather than a predefined sequence. These developments across film, television, and particularly video games reflect the growing importance of interactivity, non-linearity, and a blurring of the lines between authorial intent and audience reception in contemporary storytelling. These are narratives built on choice, on immersion, and on the subjective experience of the consumer, moving far beyond the fixed, delivered tale that Propp sought to systematize. Conclusion. Vladimir Propp's Morphology of the Folktale remains without question a foundational text in narrative theory. Its brilliance lies in its systematic approach to structural analysis, providing a rigorous methodology that was truly groundbreaking for its time and continues to inform structuralist inquiries. However, as we've explored, its scope is undeniably limited. It functions as a powerful lens for understanding Russian fairy tales, but not as a universal key to all storytelling traditions. Early critiques from structuralists like Lévi-Strauss prompted a consideration of deeper cognitive structures and paradigmatic relations, while analyses of various non-European narratives empirically demonstrated the need for frameworks that honor fundamental structural differences across cultures. The movement away from rigid function sequences toward more flexible models, such as Todorov's cycles or Tobias's plot forms, reflects an ongoing and vital scholarly effort to understand storytelling as a truly dynamic and adaptive practice. This evolution in narrative theory is not about refuting Propp, but rather about building upon his insights to develop more robust and broadly applicable analytical tools. By embracing these more adaptable frameworks, scholars can fully acknowledge and honor Propp's profound contributions, recognizing his insights into the formal mechanics of narrative, while simultaneously addressing the wonderfully varied ways narratives are crafted, experienced, and evolve across different traditions and modern media formats. The journey of understanding storytelling is an ongoing one, as rich and varied as the stories themselves.